Welcome, everyone. We'll start in a couple of minutes. Just waiting to, waiting for everyone to start coming in. We will give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join. In 2 minutes, we will start. All right. Okay, I think we can start now, and I'll make a longer introduction to wait for everyone else to join in. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar titled Cross-Regional Reflections on Violence Against Women Journalists. Thank you, everyone, for coming, for joining us in this conversation. At the bottom of your screen to the right, you should see a globe labeled interpretation, where you will find, or you will be able to change your language from English to Spanish and to French. You may also want to select mute original audio to mute the English presentations if you want to. Yes, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining. My name is Sofia Jaramillo. I'm the Senior Staff Attorney for Civic Space at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and I will be your moderator for today. This is the second webinar of a series of 3 webinars that we've organized this year, with a focus on different issues related to civic space. The first discussion that we had a couple of months ago focused on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights decision on WOSA versus Zimbabwe, and that focused mostly on the right to protest. And we made a comparison to the current status of notification regimes at the UN and at the Inter-American Human Rights System. And we will have another webinar in January focused on environmental human rights defenders. Hopefully you can join us for that one too. This webinar series that the National Endowment for Democracy has generously been supporting for the last couple of years has sought from its inception to promote collaboration among civil society from Africa and Latin America to share strategies, share lessons learned, and support each other in the face of a difficult civic space context that we're facing all around the world. Today, our webinar will focus on violence against women journalists. We're joining the Unite campaign that started last November 25th with the commemoration on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it starts a campaign of 16 days of activism that concludes on December 10 on Human Rights Day. The aim is to prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls globally, calling for action to increase awareness, to promote advocacy, and to create different opportunities for discussions on challenges and solutions. So today we will have a conversation that will start at the global level, and then we'll bring it to both the Latin American region and different regions in Africa. We'll have that conversation, And then we will discuss some of the legal strategies. So now I am very honored and very happy to introduce our first speaker. We have 5 speakers, amazing speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Julie Posetti. She's the Deputy Vice President and the Global Director of Research at the International Center for Journalists. And today, she will give us a sense of the threats women journalists face worldwide, and we will discuss some of her research on global trends in online violence against women journalists. So, Dr. Posetti, please, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. And I should add that I'm now also a professor of journalism at City University at the University of London. So I am, in fact, training the next generation of women journalists, and acutely aware of how difficult the landscape is, both in terms of the physical realm and the digital world that we occupy as journalists and as women. So I'll start by pointing out that impunity for online violence against women journalists aids and abets impunity for crimes against journalists, including crimes against women journalists offline. And to underscore the link, I'm going to refer to the research that I led over the past 4 years now, under commission from UNESCO, from the OSCE as well, and also the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, among philanthropic donors as well. And this research, in summary, represents a detailed study of online violence against female journalists in 15 countries, and which cover every region as defined by UNESCO, and also a global survey of over 700 women journalists, which was conducted at the end of 2020. Additionally, we have interviewed, my research team and I, over 180 journalists and experts in the field to provide texture and context for the analysis of that data. And we have conducted now an ongoing series of big data case studies, which began with 2 seminal studies, one based on the online violence on social media directed towards Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate, and another focused on Carol Cadwallader. Maria is based in the Philippines and the US, and Carol Cadwallader is a prominent investigative journalist based in the UK, writing for The Guardian and Observer. And she broke the Cambridge Analytica story and was involved in some prominent accountability reporting with regard to Brexit. So 2 women who have focused on accountability reporting in ways that are designed to hold power brokers to account, but also doing this investigative work in the context of large-scale disinformation campaigns, and in fact reporting on disinformation, which we know is a significant trigger for escalating threats towards women journalists. So if I can refer then to that body of work, I'm going to share some statistics with you, which I do think help to somehow make the lived experiences of women journalists, which have been shared now in terms of the online violence they experience for the best part of a decade, but which really have only recently been treated with the sort of legitimacy they deserve. And I think data is significant in that transition. So according to our survey, the women journalists who participated, of them, 73%, so nearly 3/4, said they'd experienced online violence in the course of their work as journalists. We also found that 41% of those women journalists who experienced online violence had done so in the context of what they identified as orchestrated disinformation campaigns. Really importantly, 37% indicated that the online violence they experienced was triggered or fueled by political actors. And another data point that I really want to emphasize, because it's pertinent to understand, especially with regard to legal responses, which I know you'll come to. 20% of the women journalists surveyed said they had experienced offline abuse, harassment, or attacks that they believed were directly connected to the online violence they experienced. So in other words, we're seeing patterns of online violence escalating to offline harm. And as many of the journalists we interviewed said, online violence is real world violence. It has very real consequences. There's nothing virtual about it. And those consequences range from physical realm attacks triggered by online threats and abuse, as well as what is termed lawfare by Maria Ressa. So where you see states, for example, creating an environment, so an enabling environment, if you like, for the persecution and prosecution of female journalists through patterns of online abuse, gendered disinformation in particular. And if we look at the ways in which this phenomenon is occurring, we can see that it is as prominent among journalists in New York as it is with journalists in Nairobi. There is no boundary, no geographical barrier. In fact, it's one of the tactics being used by foreign state actors in particular, to target journalists extraterritorially, so across foreign borders. So it is a genuinely global problem. It certainly has manifestations that we could describe as regional, but some of the common features include women journalists seeing their children and their parents or their partners, for example, being targeted online as well as them. So online violence against women journalists radiates. We have this common experience of disinformation being a major trigger, that is covering disinformation, not just experiencing disinformation as part of a targeted disinformation or gendered disinformation as part of a suite of responses or types and manifestations of online violence. We also see a commonality across regions with regard to the ways in which the women are being targeted. So around a quarter, and this is pretty consistent around the world, identified threats of physical violence and sexual violence, for example, in that survey. Additionally, we can highlight that women who come from an experience of discrimination that is intersectional. In other words, if women who are likely to be targeted with racist attacks as well as homophobic attacks, in addition to misogynistic attacks, are being harassed and abused online, then the online violence they experience tends to be both greater in terms of the scale of the attacks, and the impacts tend to be more severe. And this is a really important point to distinguish. As I mentioned, we have now produced 5 big data case studies which have been published to date. There are several more in process. One of those, I've got a copy with me, is focused on Ghada Ouess, who is an Al Jazeera journalist and presenter based in Qatar, and she is one of the principal presenters for the Arabic language channel. In her case, as in the case of Carmen Aristegui from Mexico, which we just published, and the case of Rana Ayub from India, which we published earlier this year, we see correlations between the actors targeting the journalists and the types of methods that are being used, but a common purpose across all of these case studies. And now we've examined something like 21 million social media posts directed at this collection of emblematic cases of women journalists. And there is one clear objective, according to our research, and that is to silence the women, and predominantly as a means of chilling their journalism, and to discredit them as well as their outlets, as well as their reporting. So there's a freedom of expression crisis in evidence here, as well as a gender crisis. And in my observation, women journalists really are proxies for women who put their head up above the parapet, who speak truth to power, whether that be in the context of science or politics or human rights defenders, for example. We see very similar playbooks being deployed internationally against all of these groups. It's also important to note that the research that we're doing is not just about documenting in ways designed to provide evidence to support policy and legislative and regulatory responses to this crisis, which I think I failed to mention is indeed facilitated by and enabled by the social media companies, the big tech platforms, and it's a situation which is only going to get worse in the context of generative AI, where we will see disinformational content, misogynistic content being able to be produced more rapidly, more easily. And when it comes to the disinformational content, it will be more believable than it has been previously. And so we are really heading further and deeper into this crisis at the same time as trying to respond more effectively to it. And one of the ways we've tried to do that is using these big data case studies to inform systems for alerting and responding to gender-based online violence against female journalists, but in a way that we hope will actually help with monitoring and responding to threats of online violence escalation into the offline world across the board, not just for female journalists. And just last month, the OSCE published this guide, which is guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists, which includes the identification based on our research of 15 indicators for online violence escalation. And these resources are available free online. I'd encourage anyone interested to access those and to be in touch if you're interested in learning more about the online violence early warning system or online violence alert and response system that we're currently developing with colleagues at the University of Sheffield's Computer Science Department. And I've lost track of time, so I'm going to leave a great pause here in case the moderator wants to intervene.
No, this is perfect. You're right on time. The 10-minute phase, you covered a lot, and thank you so much for this. We have some questions, and we've been receiving some questions, but I think we will leave it for the last part of the webinar, where we'll try to have a space of 30-minute conversation among ourselves. So thank you very much for this thorough global perspective and some zooming in into some of the cases that you've worked on. So thank you very much. And I think right now we will see also some of the more local experiences and more, we're going directly to some of the experiences from the region. So thank you very much, Dr. Busetti. This is right now, I think we're changing a little bit the order, and we're transitioning we'll hear from Hala Al-Karib, the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, SIHA, an Indigenous African Women's Rights Network working to unlock the massive potential of the women's rights movement in the Greater Horn of Africa. Today, she will highlight the specific threats women journalists are facing in the Greater Horn of Africa, as well as East Africa. And so, Hala, great to see you. Thank you for joining us. And the floor is yours. Please go ahead. You have 10 minutes or so to give us an overview. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And, my interventions is basically going to be based on, our experience as a grassroots network of feminist organizations working across the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in northern Uganda, and in South Sudan and Sudan. And Our work with female journalists is part of our support and work with grassroots women networks and right defenders across the region. We have been doing that over the past 20 years. So we worked in Sudan pre and currently during the war. We worked with South Sudan and and Somalia female journalists, particularly grassroots journalists. We have an experience of establishing grassroots journalist clubs, which has been an integral part of our programs for a long time, supporting women to tell women grassroots journalists to tell their stories in social media. And I remember, some of the female journalists we worked with as well, they had very innovative ways of sharing their stories as well, having boards under trees and running debates and conversations when the situations are relatively safe. As the presenter before me, it's a very dangerous job, but it's also, in closed and polarized societies, female journalists are very, very poor, and they are among the poorest. And in addition to the fact that they are often struggling, to have access to decent wage, they are also profiled and targeted physically and, of course, online, especially during times of crisis, even if we compare them to their male counterpart, who often enjoys a level of protections because they are recognized. They are recognized as journalists, while the female journalists, their work and their role, they often struggle, to gain recognition and acknowledgement, and that makes them way more exposed to violations. And I think, also because of the, the work they are doing, it's and the stories they are telling, which is reflections of most of the time of women lived realities. It's often been undermined and disregarded. But despite the fact that they are not being recognized, they are the first, like all women rights defenders, they are the first to be attacked in dangerous times. And unfortunately, the violation that happened to them is often is either not reported completely or underreported. Just for example, over the past 3 weeks, 2 women journalists were murdered in the war in Sudan. One in Niala in South Darfur, she was killed after the militia took over the town. And the second one, she was crushed by military pickup in Khartoum. She was reporting for a local online agency. And the level of coverage, except for the feminist groups, was extremely minimal. And it's extremely sad, and it's just and unacceptable. But this is, this is basically, what women journalists are going through, and women at the front line, in polarized and conflict areas. Aisha, she's also a member of our network. She was stuck in the conflict in Khartoum, and she didn't want to leave. She wanted to continue to report on the impact of the war and to tell us the stories of the survivors of sexual violence. It was huge hustle and complicated situation, for us to be able to relocate her. And of course, relocating, women at the front line, women journalists, women right defenders and leaders is not a priority for many of the international donors, as they understand, process resources for women to relocate. And you have to access very specific type of funding, competing, with, different crises and women across the globe. In Somalia and Somaliland, many women journalists, they were stigmatized, of course, socially and culturally, but, also, they often get killed. So poverty, and exploitations for women who are working in local media, grassroots, women journalists is quite prevalent, and also there is limited opportunities for them, to access trainings and capacity building. Feminist groups and feminist organizations like ours, who are interested in the stories and in the women and girls' lived realities, we remain to be more or less among the very few allies, of the women journalists. We both struggle to promote the stories which are, often seen, as I said, as not important stories, such as child marriage, abduction, sexual violence, or criminalizations of women. And those are the type of stories that many of the grassroots female journalists, they invest on them. And but within the mainstream, media in their societies and the societies we are working in, those stories, they are often disregarded, or they are not seen as critical or important, or kind of subjugate the female journalists, and those who are reporting on their behalf into great danger. Having said that, I think the struggle to find resources, that is specifically available for women journalists, to develop their capacity, is critical. And this situation, it's making them invisible, literally, despite the fact that they are doing great work on the ground, and they are struggling to shed light on critical and important issues of their societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala. Thank you very much for your remarks and for highlighting a lot of different issues and different challenges that journalists are facing. Yes, like even the focusing on like relocating women at the front line, women journalists and leaders, like not being a priority to international donors, like this is key. We need to find different avenues to address the plethora of risks and the plethora of needs that women journalists are facing. And I've received a couple of questions already, so I'm just grouping them for the last part of the webinar to continue this conversation. Thank you very much. And right now we will move on to the Latin American region. And just to remind everyone that you can access the interpretation, we have interpretation in Spanish and French, and the next part of the webinar, like next two panelists will speak in Spanish. So just to make sure that you have that globe on the lower right part of the of your screen, you can access there the interpretation. And so right now we will move. Yeah, I have here Michelle. Michelle, thank you. I will turn to Spanish if that's okay. Michelle, bienvenida. Gracias por unirte.
Welcome, Michelle. Thank you very much for being here with us, for joining us in this webinar. Well, Michelle Mendoza, she is a journalist from Guatemala. She specializes in covering politics and immigrant rights in Guatemala, but also in the region as of 2008. She's worked in different national and international media, including CNN and Espanol. And well, I would like to ask her if she could tell us a little bit about her experience, personal experience as a journalist in Guatemala, and to describe the impact of violence that women and journalists have had in the region, and to tell us about the situation of journalists in Central America in general. Once again, thank you very much, Michelle. You have 10 minutes more or less to share your experience. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'll go ahead and start with something simple. I have a year and 8 months in exile. I currently live in the United States. So imagine I'm listening to everything that's being said, and unfortunately, in countries such as my country, which are misogynist, repressive, and not only is it difficult to be a journalist because obviously there are interests that the corrupt would always love to cover, but it's terrible to be a female journalist because you are sexualized. I'm here because I was, they wanted to rape me, they wanted to imprison me, or even kill me. For many years in Guatemala, there has been a corporate dictatorship, as we call it, because it's financed and hosted by the traditional political elite, who from since the 1950s, they've controlled the economy of our country, and they finance political parties illegally in order to make sure that once they make it to power, they are owed powers via Congress or judicial or even executive. In my experience, it all started with the government of Jimmy Morales, which was the previous government. And I received threats, sexual abuse threats, and they paid between $50,000 to $60,000 to have a group actually attempt to attack me and rape me. I was able to deflect this situation, and during the current regime that Alejandro Jose has in Guatemala, the situation suddenly changed tone. I initiated very simple works such as the immigration caravans that were going from Honduras out to the United States. As you can probably remember, that the very first one was in 2018 October, and as I was investigating and the talks around the Guatemalan government not allowing them to continue, this is something that I said. I reported live that they were hurting, that there were aggressions towards these caravans. And this was the very first time I started to feel the threat because right after the 8 day coverage, I received flowers with a crown, funeral crown, with my name and my parents' house. Back then, I used to work with CNN in Espanol, and I received a live video call with the CNN logo and everything. So, of course, when I see the call via Telegram, I answer. When I answer, I see a man masturbating live, and he said that he was coming for me wherever I was. After this, suddenly I no longer had a normal life. I couldn't walk around the street without people taking pictures of my body, being sexualized, receiving threats of being raped, not only to myself, but also my daughters. I couldn't walk in public. I couldn't go out with my daughters. I would only make sure to go do some very important coverages, and I started dedicating uniquely to investigation. My profile went very, very low because I was receiving too many threats, especially on the social medias. And even judicial authorities, who have a very important role, are also part of these groups that the support and are providing privileged information to the known next centers. In this way, they can harass people via social network. In September of 2021, after all the situation, which I felt I was completely imprisoned in my own country, I started to investigate Alejandro Amate, and I was able to find 11 crimes financed by several groups. And in this case, these groups were constructions, a company who didn't even have the minimum requirement to apply to work for anything that had to do with the states. And 6 months going in and out of the United States investigating. In February of last year, we were able to publish it via Fernando del Rincon. I could not film my research back then because I was under too much risk. They already knew that I was onto their case, and the threats continued. So what happened after having published last year? I hit lay low a couple of months in the United States, and I'm simply waiting to see what happens. Unfortunately, the network did not respond the way I hoped they wouldn't. They did not continue. They didn't support me to find a visa, whether it's a student or work visa, because I had no guarantees. In this case, this is when I decided to return to Guatemala. And as soon as I returned to Guatemala, which is 2 months after the publication, my life was a living hell before even making it to uh, Guatemala. Someone somehow found my flight schedule, and this information is only available to privileged people. So everybody was aware that I was on my way to Guatemala, and the next day, someone threatened my father, and a third day, someone from the government, actually a media. They made a publication. They speak very ill of me as a woman, as a daughter, as a mother, and I apologize. So I had to leave. I had to flee the country 2 days later. I came here the May 3rd, and the lawyers told me that I couldn't go back to my country because the Attorney General had opened a case against me for investigating the president. After this, May 5th, Jose Ruben Zamora contacts me, and Jose Ruben Zamora is the president of a newspaper. He's been in prison for a year and a half. And on May the 5th, he says, Patoja, this is how they call women here. Patoja, don't ever go back to Guatemala because they want to see you in jail or worse. So from that day on until today, I've been living in exile. And despite that, I continue receiving threats. I had to take my family out of the country. The threats continue, and the only thing that I have left was a telephone number with the Guatemala number. And however, these people, they always found a way to filter my phone, and they would send me videos of women who were being abused, sexually abused. And obviously, these were original videos. And not only did I have to face the fear that I could be raped here in the United States despite being in exile, but I also had to deal with the frustration of not even knowing what was happening, what was the final result, and what happened to the victims that I saw. So, for my mental health, I had to get rid of that telephone. And with this, I conclude, and I tell you, we need to start differentiating and separating by gender. By gender, women journalists will be receiving a bigger threat. They're going to use our gender, and they will use it to try to mitigate, to cut you, to scare you. And this is what they attempted to do with me. They were not successful. However, once here in the United States, I realized how important it is to speak about mental health and the impact that all these different situations have in our lives. This is unfortunately not spoken too often, but it's necessary because although I speak it from a personal level and being in a different country, alone after working 18 hours a day, going to not doing anything at all these threats, they blow up in your face. And this is when you realize that mental health is vital and that at any given moment, not before and not after, this is a constant and continuous work. And this is precisely due to all the situations that we export ourselves, journalists and women in Guatemala. So I would like to conclude by saying this: it's very important to find and to establish strategies with organizations in order to find support and how to support journalists who live in repressive countries. Because once we have to move to another country, we really don't know if there are organizations that we don't know if we'll be able to receive support. And in my personal case, CNN in Espanol does not have any of the alternative or measures to support journalists that have to flee. They simply don't. And this is the very same story with the New York Times and with other very important media outlet. Why? Because yes, of course, they'll ask us to work, they'll ask us to go ahead and give it our best. But whenever we face these powers, then they don't have the tools. And lastly, mental health, once again. And with this, I conclude.
Gracias, Michelle. Muchísimas
Thank you.
gracias
Thank you very much, Michelle.
por compartir tu
Thank you so
experiencia,
much for sharing your experience, for your
por
strength, and for telling us what they force you to live. As you can see, evidently, this is not easy. And thank you for sharing for your strength for facing these attacks and for sharing the example. This is something that we have done with the research. We could speak abstract, but once we're listening to you, once we listen to what you've gone through, it confirms what unfortunately is a feature, which is a trend that women and journalists face, that sexualization, how they focus on these people's family to intimidate them, to silence them, to discredit, as Hannah was also mentioning. So thank you very much for sharing this. And of course, let's focus around the strategies, focus around the strategies of the countries. Which are the countries who can actually receive journalists? This is very, very important. Also, mental health. That is incredibly important again. So thank you very much, Michelle. So continuing with the continuing the thread and continuing with the rather more regional thread, we will continue with Raisa Carrillo. She is the legal officer of Media Defense, and this is an international organization. Here you are, Raisa. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us at the webinar, for being here with us, and for sharing your experience. So, Raisa Good Experts in Media Defense, which is an international organization which provides legal support and several other support to many journalists and many media outlets worldwide. And Raisa has also worked in Colombia and has ample experience in this subject. So, what we would like to ask you, Raisa, is if you could speak to us a little bit about the different legal strategies that many women in different countries in Latin America have. If you could cite concrete examples of anything that you've considered successful and that could give us an idea of where we could go. Thank you very much, Raisa.
Thank you very much for this presentation or introduction. And I'm very thankful with the organizers of this event and for sharing. I have gratitude for sharing this space with the panelists. I would like to share to be part of the solidarity of the words of Michelle, and women like you are the ones that help us litigate these cases to give more protection to the freedom of speech and freedom of and press, and that this is super important, and we know how difficult it is to share this. And I would like to highlight how brave she is in this case. Thank you very much. And finally, we can only do it with women that are brave, like you, and women like Jeanette, that I'm going to talk about her after. And without any further, I would like to focus a bit in what Sophia said. What is the capacity that we have in media defense? Is defense, legal defense in 3 ways for journalists: the representation in legal causes, also with funding their legal defense through and also the strategical litigation that I'm going to focus my presentation on that, and also through strategic litigation that my defense is supported through local organizations. We are looking, let's say, to be part of all these characteristics and violence that we have mentioned prior. There are around 3 examples in the cases that have been done: the one of sexual violence, also online violence, and the campaigns of defamation. And Michelle was mentioning, it's important to highlight a case where they involve the private actors like media communication. Clearly, the violence against journalist women, the objective is to silence them and to find that fragile angle that we see in all the testimonies in this, being part or in the intrusion of being with their families. It's a way of differentiating these two journalist women, and as particularly we said before, the social context of sexism, misogyny, and also the freedom of speech. And through litigation, it has a broader impact where it's determined that defense of gender equality. It has a broader reach, as I'm gonna talk about a bit later. And the cases that I would like to highlight, because that litigation is like a tool that transforms in society and also that generates an articulation from the state. I'm gonna simplicate it in a bit. And in different angles and the competences that are able to give the guarantees needed for women can be protected. Also, this journalist woman has helps in human rights and women rights, mostly when there is a feminist journalist. I think I'm gonna talk about this frame of ideas in 2 cases that generate standards regionally through the sexual violence risk that is mainly important. First is the case of Jeanette Tedorio, that it was through the Inter-American Human Rights. This case shows us that the violence the sexual violence against journalists, women journalists, and the impunity against these cases. This is a case that is for the freedom of press, and it's going nationally, and also was presented through the Inter-American Court. This journalist, she was investigating military groups in the year 2000. It was 20 years ago, and she went to a jail to interview, and she was and she was kept in the jail and was assaulted sexually, and the Colombian I think this is so emblematic for the region in the measure that they can boost the support of the Inter-American Court, and I think it's almost regional. She was kidnapped and abused in the jail, so they are looking that the state doesn't only generates the reparation, but also collective wise, and it recognized for the first time to establish protocols and differences in the characteristic violence towards women, and also creates a database to be able to monitor the type of violence. So it's a meaningful change, the production of data that allows to view and see that type of violence and to get a response statewide that are more effective. Also to create a historical center towards journalist women, so we can, through litigation, in this case, we establish a change. And in Colombia, I've been working through the implementation of this in the second regional case. It was in the European Human Rights Court against journalist woman in the digital world. She was surveilled in her home, in her private life, and also through the filming without her. They recorded a video of her having sexual relations with her partner against her will. It was recorded, and this was through a trial to find who was responsible, and the state had violated to protect her through her. And these are the two types of violence that we were talking previously, how they can be positively through litigation in order to request support. In the other way, I would like also to highlight two cases, if the time will help. Sophia, you can tell me. One is in national instances, what Michelle was talking about regarding the support of the social media or the communication media. This is a case that occurs in Colombia. A journalist, let's say, she was sexually assaulted, and through the communication media, there wasn't a protocol to receive the claims. And when these situations were through journalist situation, and this was a case that was known by the Constitutional Court. So it was important to have this internal protocol, not just through their employees, but to identify and make a differentiation of the risks when women journalists. The challenge has to be from the state, but also other actors like communication media, to identify the sexual risk of harassment or sexual attack, that it could come from the source or from their job workplace or from an external. This is the day-to-day of the journalist. And what is very important is not to make it normal, to report it and to find these legal strategies, to find more structured solutions that allow us this case of strategic litigation. Another one I would like to mention that also I work for the freedom of journalists. This is also a litigation that gathers 9 journalists of different places, and they also are part of different politic opinions, and this case allow to show a bit of the trends that we're talking about. This violence, online violence, is to generate how it's replicated, how it's normalized, and who should intervene. Let's say how to prevent, how to cut or sanction this. This case was also taken by the Constitutional Court, and it's very important to find the recognition in a high instance of this harassment online. But it's also to articulate the prosecution, and the actors, and how the politicians also use the gender balance, in particularly during election times. I'm gonna leave it there, I think, because time-wise I should, but I think these 3-4 cases shown perfectly that the litigation has that potential of transformation and prevention and protection of the journalist woman. Thank you.
And I'm going to switch to English. So thank you, Raisa. Thank you very much for your intervention and for highlighting these key cases. And yeah, the need to, like, just highlighting some of the things that you mentioned, like the need to create internal protocols in the media outlets, a way to respond to the variety and different risks that journalists are facing, and including an intersectional approach to the risks and to the threats, and how to respond to them. Thank you. I think I have a lot of different legal questions that I'll ask you later on and in the last part of the webinar. Thank you for this. And now I will invite Sarah Usonga from Article 19 from Eastern Africa to join us. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for joining us today in this panel, in this webinar. So Sarah leads Article 19's work in promoting and enabling environment for transparency and information rights in the Eastern Africa region. And we've asked her to discuss Article 19's different legal strategies addressing violence against women journalists in Eastern Africa and broadly in the region, and just to highlight some of the specific threats journalists are facing right now. Sarah, like the other panelists, you have 10 minutes to give some remarks. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Sophia. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who managed to join us today. And as Sophia adequately put it, I work for Article 19, which is a global non-governmental organization. And Article 19 works for a world where all people everywhere can freely express themselves and also actively engage in public life without any fear of discrimination or retaliation. And we do this by working on 2 interlocking rights, and that is the right to speak and the right to know. And just as my fellow panelists have highlighted, obviously, on the matter of safety or threats against women journalists in the region, is that around the world, women journalists and media practitioners are facing an increasing number of threats both online and offline. And this ranges from, disproportionate attacks to specific attacks against their work. And the Eastern African region is no different. And what we've seen, in terms of our working and documentation is that the most common threats we've documented include gender-based violence, like physical attacks, sexual harassment, and verbal abuse, both in the workplace and in the field setting. And the risk of these threats, or rather the attacks, we've noticed that they tend to intensify when women journalists are covering or reporting sensitive or controversial topics like governance, policy, human rights, even peace and security, or investigative pieces like that have, corruption issues. And so obviously in the digital era, we've also seen these violations extend to digital spaces in what we call technology-assisted violence against women. And in the realm of online harassment, we've seen a lot of cyberbullying and doxing, adding to challenges of women journalists in the Eastern African region, because the anonymity that online spaces like Facebook, X, Reddit, or even TikTok are providing, this allows them to exacerbate the intensity of this, this harassment, because it's super hard to trace who exactly is doing this. And just to reference this, in 2019, Article 19 conducted a joint, research with the Association of Media Women in Kenya. And from this research, we found that 75% of the respondents, or rather 3/4 of the respondents, had experienced some form of online harassment. And then this just, echoes obviously the statistics that have been shared by Professor Posetti earlier on, on the matter across the board, that there's, this is an existing issue. If 75% of women journalists have experienced some form of online harassment. Another context to provide on the Eastern Africa region is that the region is incredibly patriarchal, and this translates to cultural and societal constraints, such as certain restrictions on reporting of certain issues by women journalists. They receive certain limitations, based on cultural and communal expectations on what they're not able to cover. And so this also limits the nature of reporting and the attacks that they tend to receive when they cover these issues. And lastly, we've also seen an increase in political interference. Just for context, is that the African region is undergoing a lot of administrative changes in terms of elections and a lot of political turmoil. And so what we are seeing is that a lot of political interference and attempts to silence women journalists, especially by disapproving political actors who do not want to be investigated or who do not believe that female journalists should be covering certain issues. And lastly, it's just the issue of lack of safety measures, both in the newsrooms and in the field. And this is often, caused by limited resources by newsrooms to be able to provide sufficient safety and training for their female journalists in order to handle this. And so with that, just as a context, what does the law say? What is the current legislative framework or standards in the region, to be able to support the rights for female journalists working in Eastern Africa? And the truth is that a number of Eastern African countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, have, what we'll say, relatively progressive national laws. You'll see in their constitution, they guarantee the right to freedom of expression, media freedom, right to information. They also guarantee a number of gender equality and non-discrimination. And these countries are also signatories to various regional and even international human rights treaties, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. At the African region, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, even the Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa. But the reality is that these treaties, or rather all these laws, obligate African or Eastern African governments, or governments that are part of it, to ensure that all women are able to fully enjoy both the right to freedom of expression and the right to equality. And if you apply this in the context of women journalists, then this would mean that states have an obligation to both prevent, protect, and respect the right to freedom of expression. And this also should extend to instances where they are targeted in connection with their journalistic activities, and pay special attention to any gendered reprisals that they may be able to receive. But this is not what we are saying. The reality is that there's a major gap between government's understanding that the freedom of expression and women's rights are mutually reinforcing. So governments are not sufficiently recognizing that there's a mutually reinforcing nature between freedom of expression and women's rights, meaning the two cannot be implemented in isolation. They need to be implemented together. And so this level of indivisibility requires that governments need to guarantee human rights to all people without discrimination. And what we're seeing in terms of historical trends is that freedom of expression in the region has been previously used to legitimize misogynistic or discriminatory speech. And so our strategy has been to call for these governments to be able to incorporate international human rights treaties in their domestic laws to ensure that both gender equality, freedom of expression, and all these laws are equal under one. And so in terms of our impact, or what have we done so far, please allow me to share what has been happening. We have done quite a lot on both the national and regional levels. We've undertaken, various female journalists in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And this is not just journalists, but our work extended to journalists, female politicians, as well as human rights defenders. We have undertaken a lot of safety and security training, particularly digital safety and resilience for women journalists in the region. But also our focus, or our strategic focus, has been to address the issue of impunity that obviously has been a major challenge for journalists. And so just allow me, even though a lot has happened, in the interest of time, allow me to share, our big impact, or rather one of our successful impact stories in Kenya. So in Kenya, we developed a multi-sectoral approach to sexual harassment in the newsroom. And this was done through a project that we call Protect. And through this project, we worked with the Kenya Media Sector Working Group. The Kenya Media Sector Working Group is exactly how it sounds. It's a working group for all the media practitioners, or all practitioners and all stakeholders who are working in the media sector in Kenya, from news owners to media practitioners to development partners to government, all those. And we decided to discuss what we call workplace sexual harassment against women journalists. And this resulted into a gender committee to explore the current issue and how this could be addressed. And from this, we developed a model sexual harassment policy for media houses. And the model sexual harassment policy could be adopted by any individual media house, and they're able to customize it to their specific needs. And so the model policy covered topics like what exactly is sexual harassment, how do we address it, how do we ensure we set up effective internal and external complaints mechanisms to allow anonymous reporting. And so far, we have 5 media houses in Kenya that have adopted this policy. And this means that any journalist, any journalist, both male, women, and all their diversity employed by these media houses, are able to report whenever they experience any form of sexual harassment, and they're able to benefit from clear, comprehensive, and expertly crafted policies on how they'll be able to report this. We also developed what we call gendered reporting, which is an online reporting tool to monitor sexual harassment within the media houses. And we share this tool with journalists who experience such harassment, and we're able to gather this information and follow up on their cases. And this can be done either in person or anonymously if preferred. And so far, we are still following up and investigating 4 cases which have been reported as of now, and using the gender committee online reporting tools. And so far, this has been quite effective in just ensuring that we assure the victims that they can be able to safely report, and will be able to ensure that we address and ensure accountability in the work that they're in the challenges that they're experiencing in the media houses. So I can see that my time is over, but thank you so much for allowing me to share our input. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to address them. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Sarah. You were very to the point, very good with your time. So thank you very much for this, and thank you for sharing the different strategies that you've already created already, that we've already created, including that multisectoral approach to violence against women journalists. And I'm gonna take a look at the model sexual harassment policy. That sounds something that also we can bring, and maybe the other regional offices at Article 19 have already implemented that in the Latin American region, but this is something to be customized and applied to other media outlets in different regions. So thank you for sharing this. We now have 20 minutes to have a wider conversation with all of the panelists. Maybe we can, if all of you can join, I don't know if we can pin them all to the screen so everyone can see all of us. We've received a couple of different questions and we've put together some of them. Some of them are a little bit more general and not to someone specific. So I will try and reframe this a little bit and shorten it. But so thank you all for your remarks, for being here with us. And the questions is more or less like this. It is like, if the effects of violence against women journalists, if the effects are also possible to differentiate from their male counterparts, in the sense that, like, maybe within your practice, your research, your litigation, or even among your colleagues, Michelle, is if women journalists end up leaving the workforce more often, if they are giving up career opportunities, or, well, forced to not take higher risk jobs, or not given the opportunity to take those jobs, like, just to understand a little bit better the effects, the actual effects that the violence is having on women journalists, if you found something that has differentiated too. So if anyone wants to take the floor and do that, I know some of you touched upon these issues already, so.
I can start if you like, just from the global perspective again, and to bring together some of the points that others have made, including that incredibly powerful statement and very moving statement from Michelle. I just want to acknowledge that, Michelle, that was what you had to say, just reflected so much of what we have heard as researchers and practitioners in this field over the past 5 years. And you highlighted very poignantly and shockingly just how sexualized and gendered and interfering and damaging all of this is, and particularly with regards to the mental health impacts. And these are things that do differentiate male and female experiences of online violence, the terribly sexualized nature of the assaults. And I mentioned the ways in which this radiates through threats to women's children, and you know, often they're female children as well. This is deliberate and specific and different from the kinds of threats that male journalists experience. But the mental health impacts are extremely significant. In fact, it was the #1 consequence recorded globally among our survey recipients. And we interviewed, as I said, you know, around 150 of the 180 folks we interviewed were female journalists, and among them, many were seeing or seeking psychological support. Several had actually been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, specifically in connection with their extended experience or very severe experience of online violence. And we see what we refer to as networked gaslighting as well, where, you know, there, at one end there is this extreme nature of threats and abuse, threats of sexual violence, very graphic, you know, abuse. But then there's also this lower level, constant, longer timeline style of harassment and abuse, which has its own form of psychological trauma attached. And that's what we refer to there as networked gaslighting. And we saw that very much in Carol Cadwallader's case. And the objective is, you know, evoking typical sexist and misogynistic tropes, which again differentiate the abuse from that experienced by men. You know, trying to, not just trying to, describing the target as crazy in a way that is designed to destabilize, the receiver of the abuse. And additionally, just the ways in which it is forcing women into an invisible function within journalism. So our data certainly supports the concept that women are leaving the profession, and they're asking to have their bylines taken off stories. They're asking to come off camera or off air because they think that visibility makes them more of a target, which is a way of rendering those women journalists invisible. And this is a shocking trend. And in our research, the men that we interviewed were frequently connected to the women journalists, either through providing support or as colleagues or as editors, because senior positions still seem to be occupied or tend to be occupied by men in news organizations around the world. But they also verified this reality that they are less likely to be targeted when they report on the environment, on gender-based violence, on disinformation, or any number of the other incendiary issues that tend to be red flags for online violence escalation. So there's just a few points. I don't want to dominate here, but just to say that everything that Michelle described in one way or another, we have heard, although her case is particularly horrendous, we have heard elements of this, and it very much reflects the global experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. Has anyone else want to add a little bit to this, to this question, to the answer of this question? Or we can, okay, Raiza, go ahead.
Just solo un
You can
comentario.
do it in Spanish or English, however you prefer.
Justo, yo creo que por eso quería destacar en
I
el
would like
ejemplo
to highlight in the case of Janet Bedoya to create a monitor system in the violence that will put in show the state, the commitment that the state has, and the collaboration from the public ministry, the prosecution, the Ministry of Labor, and that it could be a holistic evaluation of how these different type of risks and the level could really create a state that is more precise country-wide, that what is needed to take advantage for women of journalists, and the effort of the data that they have done should be considered and have and use as referral to concentrate the efforts in a more effective way.
Thank you very much, Liza. If it's okay, we can move on to other question. We have some of this. We have one legal question, and it is, well, I think it's for, well, whoever wants to answer it, but it is, I think both of you touched on this in your intervention, but like you've already identified some of the legal standards that the systems have put forward, like some of the cases in your regions, but so what else is missing? Like, what is it, like what other standards do we need to push forward? We've focused on impunity. What other aspects of it is it? You've mentioned also the relation between digital rights and the specific violence against women journalists, but at the regional level, we're talking Inter-American Commission, Inter-American Court, African Commission, African Court, but also ECOWAS, EACJ. What is it? What other standards can we push forward? What's missing, and how can other legal strategies come in force? I think that's the gist of that question.
If I may, then I think in the African region, from the context that I shared, is that we need to specifically look at the intersection of, number one, media freedom and gender equality, because as I said in my intervention, is that these are being looked at as two isolated rights. So the question is, how do we make sure that they converge and we are being implemented at this, in tandem, and as a mutually sort of reinforcing right. The second one would be from the context that you're operating in. I'll give the example of Kenya, and this is not just violence against women journalists, but just generally violence against journalists, is that we have not been able to, at the national level, successfully prosecute any case of violence against journalists, despite multiple documented cases and multiple reported cases. Then it means that they still need, despite having a relatively progressive constitution, despite being, having, and would say in the region, we like signing really nice treaties, very nice laws, but implementation is what tends to be very much challenging. So the question is, what are we doing with the existing standards? How do we ensure that they are working before we add any other standards? Just how do we ensure that the existing laws are working for us? And for us, it's been trying to push, for instance, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority through information request. How many cases have you received on attacks against journalists? What have you done to them? And just also ensuring that we call, to address the issue of impunity. I think what we've been seeing as a pattern in the region is that even when violations against journalists, including women journalists, are documented and even sometimes, just screened in the media, what we get is an apology from the president or a politician, but really nothing to follow up. So the question is, how do we ensure that these standards are effective and address the issue of impunity? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Right, so I think you already mentioned some of them, but if you want to add to this, go ahead, or Hala, if you...
Very quickly, creo que lo que dice Sara es supremamente
I believe
importante.
that what Sarah says is extremely important in regards of the documentations to legal effects as they are documented from the civil organizations, this type of aggressions. And many times they need from an forensic expertise to achieve document in a good quality, in a good way, the damage, and be able to maintain the information so it's valid through the legal process. From there, another of the big challenges is to understand how issues about technology and privacy of women journalists that expose, and also that allows in a level, let's say, from a legal strategy to make the arguments more robust, to have more impact, those intromissions in the privacy of a presumption, and that allows also that through the litigation, they could demand reparations and correct the system and articulate it. And that's an issue that is more than litigation. It's a successful one to maintain the efforts, a sustainability of the efforts when they take the litigation, when they are through the process, and to have these measures develop or enforce.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. We have also a question. Oh, Hala, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, I just
saw
want
you
to
unmute.
emphasize, the fact that there is a gap between laws and policies and the realities of the female journalists. And I'm speaking particularly about grassroots and female journalists. And I think there is a need to elevate and support and empower the networks of the female journalists to enable them to access, legal resources and legal aid and help, because it's typically it's just that gap that exists between what's actually on papers and the reality to navigate, the route to get to the, and receive the support that they need. And that's such a complex, I would say it's a complex process. Yeah.
Thank you, Hala. And this is a great segue for the question that we received for Michelle. And it is just that during your intervention, Michelle, you spoke about the importance of creating opportunities to support journalists who are forced into exile. And like based on your experience and what you have lived, like what particular strategies should be employed to support women journalists in exile? So if you've had any opportunities, how you've come to them. So go ahead, Michelle. You're muted. Estás con...
Ahí está, perdón. Gracias. Básicamente,
Thank
pues
you.
yo
Basically, well, I was finding the tools through the way. I had no idea or information that they have Freedom House, CPJ, the ICFJ in the US, that are organizations that can support you. Because it is very easy to say, I'm going to a different country, but our salaries in countries like mine are very low for journalists. So you go to a different country and you don't have or money or even to have take an Uber, where to live, you don't know where to go, where you're gonna be at. So in my case, I have the fortune that many people that in Food Life, they told me, when you have support, let us know. I had to articulate and do a net of between 25 and 40 people in Guatemala and outside that belonged to organizations and people. And through them, I was able to find tools, let's say, which organization can help me with the process of asylum, because here it can be up to $25,000 of that type of process, legal process, and our means doesn't allow me, at least for me, it didn't. So I found an organization that is called 1,000 Women, Mil Mujeres, that help you through all the victims or women that are vulnerable and come here to this country finding support. And I accomplished that. And also to CPJ, CPJ, they have opened doors in different spaces here in the US to tell my story, because it's very difficult. Sometimes I have to not, it's difficult for me to tell my story, very painful parts. And I have to say it out loud precisely because the ones that are coming behind me can have the tools and they don't have to go through all that suffer that I went through a long period of time. I was depressed, that I was working with contention psychology. So I think what we should do is articulate a net of people from the region or the whole world, so we know and we can inform which are those organizations that can support us, that in certain moment we have to run from our countries. It exists, but I think we need more dissemination so we are aware, because in Guatemala the community press is more in risk. They don't know that they have Freedom House for this organization. So I think we should disseminate, we should do a platform so we can share it worldwide, mostly for human journalists, women journalists, which organization can support us.
Thank you, Michelle. I think this is a great way to I just got the minute warning, so this is a great way to conclude this webinar, this conversation. This need to strengthen the networks. You talked to us about, you put in words and you gave a face to a lot of the things that we are researching, we're litigating, we're advocating, and these are real stories, this is real people. Everything that's happening to women journalists around the world is real, and we need to do that, continue articulating our efforts, articulating policy, legal strategy, and the communication with women networks and with women journalists, and just continue having that conversation and that exchange. Thank you very much to all of the panelists and to everyone that joined us today. We will post this on different social media channels so everyone can watch it later on. Thank you very much for joining and have a great rest of your days.